Protein is going to give you a heart attack? What's up, guys? We're back with another educational video, and this week we are talking about protein and heart disease. New paper, got a lot of attention out there. But first, make sure like, subscribe, follow the algorithm. You know the drill. Leave a comment. Tell me how much you love ladies. Or tell me how much you hate my stuff, but you're still watching it because you're in the comments. So a new paper came out in Nature, which is a very, very high-ranking journal, and it got a lot of attention. A lot of people sent it to me. It was in the news. And once again, we had a case where the problem isn't with the study. Problem is with the hot takes on social media about said study. Let's talk about it. They had basically kind of three arms to this study. The first two were human components. One was where they were feeding a very high protein shake. So they were feeding a shake of either 10% protein or 50% protein from calories and looking at the responses of mTOR activation in some immune cells, some monocytes. This sort of monocyte is the kind of macrophage that is one of the most prevalent in macrophages that end up in the endothelium during heart disease. So basically, part of heart disease is the infiltration of these immune cells, these macrophages, into the blood vessels, into the endothelium. So again, remember, mechanism. So they were looking at mTOR activity in these monocytes, macrophages, and looking at the inhibition of autophagy and apoptosis. They did that with shakes that were, I think they were about 500 calories, 10% protein or 50% protein. And then they did it with mixed meals that were like a little bit more moderate, like 15% protein versus 22% protein, because they wanted to be a little bit more physiological. And then they also did this in a mice study, in a rodent study, where they fed different diets containing different amounts of protein, low, moderate, and high, and looked at lesions in the blood vessels, okay? I think it was over an 8-week period. Now, they honestly measured a bunch of stuff. Like in the humans, in these monocytes, they looked at plasma amino acids, plasma leucine, kind of markers of autophagy and infiltration of monocytes. I'm just going to go through some of the stuff they looked at because it was, quite frankly, a massive scope. They looked at using single amino acids. The mouse study, they had groups where they were, like, for example, the moderate protein group, they added amino acids to make it match the high protein group, or they added leucine to make it match the leucine content of the high protein group. And just really like a huge amount of data here. Now, what did they find? Well, interestingly, they actually found what I found similarly in my graduate school thesis looking in skeletal muscle, which is a leucine threshold where below which you don't really get activation of mTOR in skeletal muscle, and above which you do get an activation and you get an increase in muscle protein synthesis. So it appears that the level of leucine that initiates this is pretty similar, okay? What does all this stuff mean? First off, what is mTOR? mTOR is the mammalian target of rapamycin, is what it's called. mTOR is responsible for initiating a cascade of signals that initiate what's called translation initiation and protein synthesis. So translation initiation is the rate-limiting step of protein synthesis. There's a lot of you guys out there like, oh, Lane just did a degree in nutrition. Oh, you know, thinking, I guess I just stared at the food guide pyramid for 6 years. So let me walk you down a little bit of physiology and biochemistry. In order to create protein from your genetic encoded material, say, like if you're wanting to create in skeletal muscle, new muscle, that is encoded for in your DNA. That has to be transcribed into mRNA, and then it goes through several other modifications as well. And then that mRNA has to be translated into an actual protein, okay? And it's translated by something called a ribosome. And translation initiation is the specific process where the ribosome latches on to the mRNA and begins incorporating these amino acids into a growing polypeptide chain to form the protein. The specific step of rate-limiting translation initiation is the assimilation of a complex called EIF4F, eukaryotic initiation factor 4F, okay? This complex basically acts as a scaffold for the ribosome to hook on to the mRNA, okay? The rate-limiting step of the EIF4F complex formation is for these two smaller complexes called EIF4E and EIF4G to come together. And mTOR, when it's activated, basically facilitates that coming together because mTOR phosphorylates a binding protein called 4-EBP1, and when 4-EBP1 is phosphorylated, it releases EIF4E, and it can now bind with EIF4G. mTOR also phosphorylates EIF4G, which increases its affinity for EIF4E, which helps with the assembly of this EIF4F complex, the ribosome to get hooked on, and translation can start. Also, mTOR phosphorylates a protein called ribosomal protein S6. This protein specifically will selectively increase the production of complexes involved in the assembly of protein. Okay, so basically it helps improve the capacity for this whole thing to happen. Okay, so that is the really intense biochemistry behind it. Now, it appears that this pathway is conserved between a lot of different cells because we see this in skeletal muscle. I'm pretty sure we see it in liver, and it looks like we see it in monocytes as well because they looked at mTOR activity, they looked at ribosomal protein S6, and they saw, again, at similar levels of protein that activate these things in skeletal muscle, you get a similar level of activation in these monocytes. What does that actually mean? Well, their kind of, I don't want to say speculation, but their hypothesis is that by activating mTOR in these macrophages or these monocytes, you are going to basically make it so that they live longer, they're more active, and they're more likely to penetrate the endothelium and lead to a causative factor for heart disease. In the human aspect of this, they're looking at about 3 hours, the 3-hour period after a meal, and looking at this increase in mTOR activity in these monocytes. Okay, so in the mouse arm of the study, they tested a low protein, which is 7% of calories, a moderate protein, 21% of calories, and a high protein, 46% of calories, I believe it was, for 8 weeks in these mice. And they looked at the formation of like plaque and lesions in the blood vessels. What they found was there was kind of a linear response of mice who ate low, moderate, and high protein getting higher levels of plaque and lesions. Now, everyone's taken this and been like, oh my God, protein's going to cause you to have a heart attack. So some caveats to this. First off, the mouse arm portion of this was in ApoE knockout mice. Mice that have ApoE knocked out, meaning they have the gene removed, have extremely poor lipoprotein clearance. They have very high levels of cholesterol and LDL in the blood, and they develop heart disease. These animals get heart disease and fairly rapidly. So that's one caveat. The other caveat is, let's go back to the human arm of things, all right? So they looked at post-meal mTOR activation, saw mTOR activation was greater, and there's concern about this because it's going to lead to these monocytes having greater penetration of the endothelium and causing heart disease. Using this logic, you should not eat carbohydrates or fats either, because if you eat carbohydrates in the short term raise insulin. High glucose is bad for you. If you have long-term elevations in blood glucose, it's very bad for you. If you have long-term elevations of insulin, it's bad for you. But this is a short-term post-meal response. The logic is similar here. An acute increase in mTOR activation for a few hours is not the same as a chronically dysregulated signal. And I can make the same argument for fats. High-fat meals have been shown to impede flow-mediated dilation. And impeded flow-mediated dilation has been shown to be a risk factor for heart disease. So can't eat protein, can't eat carbs, can't eat fats. Guess we're just gonna have to photosynthesize. Oh, damn, there's skin cancer. Maybe the fasting people had it right. Just never eat food. You know, or you can be like one of those crazy people who believe that they get their sustenance from the earth, man, and they can just lie on the earth and the electricity flows through them and the vibrations flood their cells. And yeah, they're full of shit. You need food, otherwise you can't make ATP. So anyways, that arm of the human study, I mean, it's interesting data, but again, based on that same sort of logic, you can't really eat anything because in the short term, you can find that any food, any macronutrient initiates some sort of negative response. Now, in the mouse arm portion of it, it's interesting data, but we are talking about genetically modified mice. How applicable is that to human beings? I mean, it's interesting data. Again, I think it's worth pursuing further with more stringent human randomized control trials and perhaps stronger cohort data. But that is just something that I go, okay, that's interesting, but I don't know what that really means for the real world. And so this is a case where it's not a bad study. The study itself was actually quite well done. In fact, I love the fact that in the mouse study, they also had groups of mice where they took the medium or the moderate protein diet and they supplemented with leucine to match the leucine content of the high protein diet, because we did something similar looking at skeletal muscle and saw basically the same level of protein synthesis, basically showing that leucine was the key amino acid regulating this. And they did the same thing and saw very similar results in these monocytes. The other thing that's interesting that was kind of really glossed over was that there was an inverse relationship between protein intake and body fat in these mice. And so you have mice that have chronically elevated levels of lipoproteins. Is it possible that in a specific context of very elevated cholesterol and LDL that high protein may have a small further negative effect? I mean, maybe, but I mean, we don't know that because we don't have human data to back that up. If protein can help somebody lose weight, because we have shown high protein diets, and even in this study, high protein diets help reduce body fat, guess what is a much stronger predictor of heart disease than any of this stuff? Obesity. So again, if a high protein diet can help somebody lose weight and get their body fat level under control, that is a far bigger benefit than worrying about mTOR activation in monocytes. Am I ready to say that, hey, there's absolutely no concern, we shouldn't be worried about it? I'm not ready to say that, but you can't say that about carbs and fats either with heart disease. Carbs increase inflammation after a meal. Like your levels of IL-6 go up. Well, IL-6 can damage, inflammation can damage the endothelium. Okay, well, fats, low-mediated dilation. So again, I think it's interesting data, but I think people get way too caught up in the weeds on this stuff. Eat a balanced diet, eat a lot of fiber, a lot of fruits and vegetables, eat high quality lean sources of protein, resistance train, do some cardiovascular exercise, don't smoke, don't drink, don't do drugs, kids, manage your psychological stress, get enough sleep. Like, that's the stuff that actually matters. This is the problem with these studies, is people will read the headlines and they just don't know what to do. Well, last month they said don't eat fat, and this month they're saying don't eat carbs, and now they're saying don't eat protein. And so people get so frustrated, they just go, well, everything's going to kill me, so I might as well just eat whatever the hell I want. And that is the danger of this messaging, because people get so much anxiety, they feel like they can't do anything right. So guess what? They do nothing. So again, hey, if I wanted to break it down, control your calories, maintain a lean or normal body weight, exercise regularly, get enough sleep, manage your psychological stress, don't drink, don't smoke, don't do drugs, and don't worry, be happy. That is why our app, Carb Diet Coach, we really focus on the big rocks when it comes to nutrition. We're not getting you caught up in the minutia, and we make it adaptable for you, and we make it so it fits your dietary preference, your individual metabolism, and it adjusts as you go based on how you respond, so that you can continue to make progress towards your goal. So make sure you click the link in the description and check out Carb Diet Coach. I have personally been using it for almost 5 years now, all the way back to the beta version. It has worked through lean gaining phases, through cutting phases, through reverse dieting phases, through maintenance phases. It's worked in every single phase I've used it. So I cannot recommend it highly enough. Less than $10 a month for customized nutrition coaching. Make sure you check it out in the description, and I will catch you guys next week.